What's up, guys? This is BlackMoonDragon here, and I'm here with my best friend,
KvChaosGamer.
Okay, so I don't know about you guys, but personally, I'm a big fan of creepypastas, and so is KvChaosGamer. And one of the things that we've noticed about creepypastas is that oftentimes people accept them as truth, think that they're real stories, and we were wondering how much truth is there really in those stories. So this channel is devoted to finding that out. So in this series, we're going to take various creepypastas, go through the stories, and observing little facts and certain interesting points in the stories, we're going to discuss the realisticness of the story and whether or not we think they really happened, or if they're just a clever, or in some cases not so clever, work of fiction. So, as you can see by the screen, today we are doing one of KvChaosGamer's top 10 favorite creepypastas, the Russian sleep experiment. It's in your top 10, right? That's what you said?
Yeah, it's in my top 10.
Okay. Good, so I'm just gonna start off by summarizing the story. I'm not gonna read it because that would take forever and that's time we don't have. So yeah. Basically, the Russian sleep experiment takes place in the late 1940s, after the war. Some Russian scientists are testing out an experimental gas that is supposed to give the user sleep deprivation. This experiment is tested on 5 subjects who are considered enemies of the state. At first, everything runs smoothly, but after a few days, the patients start acting strangely. At some point, the patients use their own feces and pages of paper to block the windows so that the scientists cannot view them. Horrible screaming is heard from inside the chamber. When they finally decide to investigate, the soldiers are horrified to discover that the patients self-mutilated themselves. Sorry for being redundant there. They tore their own muscles off the flesh to the point where the bone was now visible. Their intestines were hanging out of their bodies on the floor, the digestive fluids in their stomach still digesting. Several of the experiments die early on. Some of the other experiments kill some of the soldiers that are overseeing the experiment, and at some point they decide to put the experiments on operating tables and see what would happen if they continued exposing them to the gas. And basically throughout the story, the patients become dependent on the gas. They want more of it. They're afraid of going to sleep. And overall, it's just a very creepy story. But is there any truth to it? Let's find out. So, Chaos, let's start with you. What are some things that you noticed about this story?
Alright, well, one thing I want to go over is the time period and what it's set in. The late 1940s, after World War II. Now, for some who aren't quite familiar, history, during the 1940s, World War II happened. A lot of countries were involved, a lot of innocent people died. And one of the enemies, well, used to be allies of Nazi Germany, was Soviet Russia. And when the Germans invaded Russia, because they saw them as pretty much, they had no more use for them, it was a pretty nasty conflict, and I'm trying to remember what all happened. I need to brush up on my history a little, so please forgive me.
Didn't the Russian economy collapse?
Kind of, yes, it did. I mean, they did suffer a lot of damage, like in a lot of the major outlying areas in some of the inner cities, such as Stalingrad, where a lot of the damage was more inflicted. And during that time, the Russians were focusing more of their resources and money on producing weaponry, vehicles, and building as much troops as possible for the front lines to fight the Germans and to push them back. And after the war, more of their time would have been spent rebuilding. And I for one don't really know, but I mean, who knows, they could have done some weird
Experiments?
Yeah, some weird experiments, but for something like this, especially set in the particular time period, like I said, a lot of their time, resources, and money would have been more focused on rebuilding.
So, you think it's not so likely that they would have had the money to fund this kind of project, is that correct?
I mean, they probably would have already had the facilities probably ready, but how good they would have been, that's
questionable.
Yeah, that's questionable. But for something like this, it would have to be a very well-secured facility. Almost like underground bunker. Like something similar to what Hitler used during the final days of the war.
I see.
And for something like that, that would take up quite a bit of resource and would cost quite a bit of money to do, especially during that time period. So I find that a little hard to believe they would have been able to do something like that. And let's also not forget that at that time, as far as, experimental weaponry and experimental, gases, that wasn't really something the Russians were really known for.
That was something that is more Nazi-esque than Russian.
Yeah, Nazi scientists would have had a lot, they would have had a lot more to do with stuff like that. I mean, there's a whole lot of crazy experiments and a whole lot of, crazy plans and ideas the Nazis had. And while they may have sounded good on paper, but in reality, some of them would have been just way too overly complicated to even do. Or there would have been just no way it would have been able to get off the ground.
So in other words, if the story had been called The Nazi Sleep Experiment or something like that, that might have been a little more believable for you?
Yeah, that would have been a lot more believable. And also, not all the Nazis were captured. Some of them, as far as some of the Nazi scientists goes, a lot of them kind of not really like switch sides, I guess you could say, but more like it's more of like an exchange, like for the crimes they like committed, that they would lend their like I guess you could say like scientific expertise to like the allies in helping them develop like weapons and other like stuff.
I see.
So like the U.S. managed to get a few well-known Nazi scientists, along with like Great Britain, some other European countries, and also Soviet Russia. But by the time they would have been able to actually, do experiments like that, it probably would not have been until like maybe mid to late 1950s. Probably even early 1960s.
Okay. So, that's a very interesting point. And if you don't mind my jumping in here really quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Some of the things I've noticed about the story pertain to the condition of the test subjects. And what really struck out to me is the level of self-inflicted harm that they do. I mean, tearing their own muscle off to the point that you can see the bone. I don't care what drug you're on, that will kill you. I mean, that is bound to sever some arteries, you'll bleed out, and...
Just go into shock. Sorry for interrupting.
Oh, no, I like that point. You'll go into shock, you'll bleed out, no one can survive that, basically. And another thing, obviously, I mean, they were using their own feces to block out the windows and stuff. Now, think about that. Don't you think if they have exposed wounds and the inside of their room is that filthy, don't you think they would have gotten deathly ill and died or something?
Well, depending on what the sanitary conditions were, like if the war wasn't any, then yeah, they probably could have contracted some sort of infection.
And... oh, I'm sorry about that.
No, sorry, one thing I also kind of want to mention, like antibiotics at the time, along with painkillers, were very primitive.
Like vodka primitive?
Yeah, vodka primitive.
You guys see what I did there. Anyway.
Oh yeah, no,
anyway. So, that was one thing that really stuck out to me, that the patients didn't die through all of that harm they inflicted on themselves, but at one point in the story, it says that they were able to kill some of the Russian soldiers. Okay, so would somebody please care to explain to me how a guy who ripped their own muscle mass off and shouldn't have enough support to move their arms somehow have the strength to kill a tough-as-nails Russian soldier? Somebody please explain that to me. These guys shouldn't be able to stand, let alone kill someone, and yet the story describes it as if it were no big deal, and that really bothered me. Another thing I'd like to point out is a little discrepancy pointed out on the creepypasta wiki by user The Small Pancake. His exact comment is, "This is super great. The only thing I noticed as wrong, though, was that it started out with 5 subjects. One was dead upon entering the room, another died shortly after he ruptured his spleen and bled out. Then another one died on the operating table. But the story continues with 3 subjects as if one of them hadn't died. Other than that, this is one of my favorite stories, really inspirational, heart. So, that is something that also strikes me as interesting, that the story kind of there's a little bit of a paradox there. You start out with 5 people, 3 of them die, and then there's 3 left. Wait a minute. Correct me if my math is wrong, but I'm pretty sure that 5 minus 3 is 2, not 3. There was another thing that really jumped out to me, and that is, if this really was some big secret experiment, then how does the author know about this? Don't you think the Russian government really would have kept this tightly under wraps? Chaos, your thoughts on that?
Okay. Now, at the time during the height of the Soviet Empire, when it came to, top secret stuff, they made sure that, or at least tried to make sure that none of that would come out. And if it did,
KGB would pay you a visit.
Yeah, I mean, and what just kind of confuses me on this, or I don't know if confused would really be the right word for this, but if this is indeed true, and like you said, I do want to know how the author managed to get this sort of information, because if there was someone that was actually on the inside that actually knew about this, or was actually like in on the experiment, chances are the Russian government would have either had some sort of catch on him, or he probably would have been what would you call it, like with Edward Snowden, he would have help me out here.
He'd be tightly monitored, closely monitored.
Not so much tightly monitored, but if he wanted to kind of avoid, having the Russians find him, he would be hiding in maybe in another country, asylum.
Yeah.
Whoever this person was, where he got the information from, would be seeking asylum in another country, avoiding, having the Russian government find him. And when it comes to the sort of people who, need this sort of information, at the time, the KGB, which is basically the Soviet version of America's CIA, they didn't make sure they didn't tell anyone, or if they did tell anyone, they took care of it, if you know what I mean.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know, I find this real hard to believe, and also another part that kind of bothered me was the part where how these test subjects killed the Russian soldiers.
Yeah.
Why didn't they fire back? At that time, even though their weaponry was also pretty primitive, they had, some pretty good, decent bolt-action rifles and, submachine guns. Why weren't any of them even armed? I don't think the story even mentioned if any of them were armed.
Well, I think there's one part where someone shoots one of them with a pistol or something, but yeah, you bring up a good point. I mean, why, as soon as they walked in there and saw these experiments, why didn't they light them up like Christmas trees? I mean, why did they let the experiments live and say, well, let's see what happens. Let's give them more gas and see how they react to it. Don't you think a normal person would have said, oh my gosh, it's a monster, kill it with fire, da-da-da-da-da-da-da? You see what I'm saying? Their reaction to the circumstances don't sound very appropriate or realistic. And I think that you bring up a good point there.
And one thing I also kind of wanted to mention, like during World War II with Russian soldiers, they were more trained to shoot first, ask questions later. So they were
Yeah.
pretty ruthless. So now that's not to say all of them were like that, but a very good majority of them were.
Oh, yeah. So, do you think you're ready to do final thoughts on the story, or do you have some more points you'd like to make, or where are you at?
What about the part where they speak? That part also kind of
Oh, yeah, you're right.
because one would think that the amount of self-inflicted harm that they have, that especially with pulling a lot of their insides out, one would think they really wouldn't be in no condition to even speak. Or who knows if the gas even had some sort of an effect on their ability to speak. But like the story says, apparently they could. So
Yeah, I mean, don't you think that their flesh being ripped off and stuff, their organs being exposed, do you think that would really make it difficult for them to speak, wouldn't it?
even form coherent sentences.
Yeah, that really doesn't make much sense.
And also, like, one thing I do kind of want to mention, like, the effects of sleep deprivation.
Deprivation.
Deprivation, yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
For some reason, I can't speak at all tonight. But anyways, the effects of it in real life, like, compared to what is told in the story, it's almost like night and day. I mean, it's still scary, but the effects of it in real life, if you're to deprive yourself of sleep for, let's say, like, about 3-5 days, you're gonna start to becoming kind of ill. You're definitely gonna feel some side effects. And if you were to continue on, let's say past a week or longer, you would kind of like go into shock, or you would suffer like cardiac arrest or something, and you'd pretty much die.
What I'm noticing is that your description of real life sleep deprivation causes people to become a little more to get a little weaker, become
Yes.
deathly ill, most certainly not have the level of activity that the patients in the story have.
One thing I also wanted to mention is that also, like, I think also from what I heard, that hallucinations is also like a symptom too, so. But I guess it would vary, from person to person who's ever gone through it.
Yeah. Well, I think that just about sums up all of the interesting points there regarding the story, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Okay, so what are your final thoughts on this story?
My final thoughts. Okay. It's a good story, don't get me wrong. And I love it, and like I said, it's definitely in my top 10 favorite, creepypastas. But it's a work of fiction. It's not real. There's just no way something like what is told in the story could actually happen in real life, especially during that time. But also, that's not to say maybe some sort of experiment similar to this could have been conducted by either the Russians or the Germans or, whatever country, but there's just no way that anything like that could just happen. But it's still a good story, and I personally love it. I would definitely recommend anyone who's either new to creepypastas or it's never really, thought about reading creepypastas, I would definitely recommend reading this.
Okay. My thoughts on the story are that the story does have its flaws.
Which it does.
Yeah. But it's still a good story, and it's definitely better than a lot of the cliche, stereotypical pastas that you see floating around the web. This one is definitely a bit more imaginative. But is it real? No, I say that this story is busted. It's definitely a work of fiction. It's not real, guys. Now, for those of you die-hard believers out there, I will say, before you start typing up your rage comments, I'd just like to say that, if you still believe the story is real, you're totally free to do that. We don't have a problem with it. All we're doing is pointing out some things that we noticed and explaining why we think this story is real, or in this case, fake. But you're all still entitled to your own opinions. We're not trying to affect the way you think or anything.
Yeah. And if you still have a problem with it, maybe it's time to take off the tinfoil hat.
Oh, dude, now you've done it. Okay, so, anyway, I think that's done it for this episode of Urban Legend Busters. And if you have any creepypastas, myths, or urban legends that you would like for us to take a look at, please leave it down below in the comments section, and we'll take a look at it. I'll leave the link down to this story so that you guys can check it out if you're interested. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. This has been BlackMoonDragon with
KvChaosGamer.
Have a wonderful day, and
bye for now.